Well, many salutations, all of you. It's been an interesting week since my last podcast, and I've had a lot, I'll be honest, I've had a lot of work to do. I have been working on several pieces for an exegesis I need to get done. For those of you that don't know what an exegesis is, that's where to exegete is to pull out meaning from a text. So I have been exegeting a passage from 1 Samuel um, in the Bible, and that has been interesting, to say the least. And a lot of the work I've done in the past has sort of helped me with that, but regardless of that, I was thumbing through some of these passages in the Bible, and it really struck me the importance of human life and what that means. And there is a philosophical discussion right now in America having to do with what is the value of human life, what is the value of human need, just another human being. In my last couple of podcasts, I discussed morality, I discussed what it means, I discussed a lot of things. And I think there is a strong sense of justice in America where we want the right thing to be done, but in people's zeal to do the right thing, they're not collecting genuine understanding, and they are not considering the value of other people. It's almost like Hollywood movie syndrome. In a classic Hollywood movie, in just a classic fantasy story, you have the bad guy, and the bad guy is dehumanized. You don't need to know the story of the bad guy. Well, unfortunately, in the modern era, we've been dehumanizing heroes too, which is so sad. You look at a lot of these more recent movies that have come out, and just a more recent one like Underwater, which is kind of like a sci-fi horror. Underwater is very interesting because the protagonists, the heroes, you don't have any backstory on them. It's very odd. They're all caricatures. They're not really people with genuine personality and something going on. They're just caricatures of stereotypes or social agendas. It's very odd. And so we're dehumanizing people all across the board, but classically we have dehumanized villains, at least always dehumanized villains. We don't need to know where the villain comes from. In fact, stories where we look at where the villain comes from, people do tend to flock to those because people actually like to know people's stories. And the recent Joker movie made with Joaquin Phoenix is a great example. People just, for whatever reason, people would like that movie. I never went to see it. I didn't really want to see it when it came out. But people would like that movie because it told the story of a villain. People want to know stories. But at the same time, are the social trend with our cultural leaders. And by cultural leaders, I mean people that are driving our cultural movement, our progress, in quotes. They don't seem to be concerned with the individual value, what an individual is. They're concerned with the group. They're concerned with the group identity. What does it mean for the group? What does it mean for the label that we're putting on these people? What does it mean for the demographic? But the individual itself, it doesn't. And that is one of the most basic characteristics of humanity, human rights, is just concern for the individual. And I am not, and I've said this in the past, but I am not making a case for blanket individualism. But without concern for the individual, civil rights disappear. You can't say that only the rights of people of large groups shall be discussed, because of course you're going to miss something. You can't say people from group X and people from group Y are studied. People from group X have an advantage generally over people from group Y. Therefore, we shall disadvantage X in order to benefit Y. Well, obviously, there's diversity in both X and Y. So the underprivileged in X are now going to be disserviced unfairly, and the overprivileged in Y will be serviced unfairly. It doesn't make any sense. So without referring to the individual, you cannot possibly do civil rights correctly. In fact, the whole civil rights era was about in the United States, the classic civil rights here, the 60s and 70s, was about rebelling against the idea that individuals boil down to just pieces of a community. We can treat all black people like this because all black people are this. We can treat it doesn't matter what the demographic is. So what it gets me is in ancient history, you have a turning point where individuals now become important over groups. And throughout history, people have tried to pinpoint where exactly that takes place. I heard a lecture on somebody's talking about the Code of Hammurabi, and where the Code of Hammurabi begins this sort of thought process where we want to establish guilt versus innocence, and that's where it comes from. But I look over the Code of Hammurabi, and what the Code of Hammurabi deals with is, yeah, there's guilt versus innocence in a very basic level. But the Code of Hammurabi is written in order to help people get along. And that's what its job is. It's built to help people function together without slaughtering each other, which that's basically it. And later laws, Egyptian law, Akkadian law, deal largely in the same type of thing. But what's interesting is when you get to the Bible, you get the law of Moses, and you have something that you've never really seen before in ancient history. I'm going to read this part to you. This is just one example. I'm going to read this part to you. This is in Deuteronomy 21. If a slain person is found lying in the open country, in the land which the Lord your God gives you to possess, and it is not known who has struck him, then your elders and your judges shall go out and measure the distance to the cities which are around the slain one. First off, the fact that anyone is taking this kind of effort in order to figure out who slew a person in the open country is phenomenal. But listen to this. It shall be that the city which is nearest to the slain man, that is the elders of that city, shall take a cow from the herd, yada, 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 and the elder of that city shall bring the cow down to the valley and with running water, basically kill the cow as penance. Then the priest, the sons of Levi, shall come near, for the Lord your God has chosen them to serve him, to bless in his name, bless in the name of the Lord. So basically, all the elders in that city, this is in verse 6, all the elders of that city which is nearest to the slain man shall wash their hands over the cow whose neck was broken in the valley, and shall answer and say, our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it. Forgive your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, O Lord, and do not place the guilt of innocent bloodshed in the midst of your people Israel, and the blood guiltiness shall be forgiven. So you shall remove the guilt of innocent blood from your midst when you do what is right in the eyes of the Lord. This is one person in the middle of nowhere, found dead, and they have to establish. They don't know who did it. They can't figure out who did it, but somebody has to atone for the sin of their slaughter and their death, which is, to me, that's remarkable. There's a different sense here. There's not just the sense of we have transgressed God's law. There is a sense of this, and no one even knows how this person necessarily died, but we have to make sure that we atone for this person's death, like it really means something. If this person didn't mean anything, they wouldn't care. It wouldn't be a big deal. And that's kind of the situation with a lot of the older ancient codes, is like, if a servant dies, it doesn't mean as much if a real person, quote unquote, dies. And in this particular instance, just a random person's death is so important. Why is it so important? And this is the thing, is it could have been a foreigner, and you look at this as well, like no laws deal well with foreigners. But in the Bible, you have laws that deal with don't mistreat the foreigner. If you mistreat the foreigner, God will punish you. It actually is very, very detailed. The Lord says that if you mistreat the foreigner who is among you, then the consequence will be, I will take your lives and I'll make uh, your children fatherless and your wives widows. I mean, God takes it seriously how you treat other people. And it doesn't matter who they are. Now, there are places in the law where he talks about you go into this territory and this land, and when you conquer it, you take people's lives. There's that too. But you have to look at this from the perspective of, if it's not that they're foreigners is the reason that God has commanded that. It's not that they aren't people that God has commanded that. This isn't a prejudice thing or a racial thing. This isn't. If that's the case, then why would there be such good treatment of foreigners? There are protections for people that, when we look back in history, at least our modern listeners, our modern academics tell us there weren't supposed to be protections for. And there's protections for marginalized people on the margins of society all over the Old Testament. And so what does that show you? It shows you that human beings themselves have value. And in the church, we call this the Imago Dei. The Imago Dei is basically the image of God, and that all human beings exhibit the image of God. And that's why they have intrinsic value. Because without the idea of the Imago Dei, you could literally look at somebody and say, you know what, you're less valuable than somebody else. Because you just don't contribute as much. And you've heard that utilitarian argument before, like, we're trying to decide who's going to live and who's going to die in a crisis situation. Well, let's gauge how each person's importance to the whole is. And rather than, or just looking at who seems to be more valuable according to some other code of conduct, or who actually can just establish their dominance is going to be the one that survives. Well, none of that happens in the Old Testament. Each individual life is treated as an end in and of themselves. And the only way to get that end in of itself is for them to have some kind of property that makes their life more valuable than any other value. And the only thing that stands in that place is the image of God. That's the unique thing you see in Scripture. And I think it's interesting when we talk about human rights that we need to be so careful not to remove the image of God, the Imago Dei, from anybody that we talk about. When you talk about somebody you disagree with, you have to be so careful to humanize them. When you talk about people that you don't like, it could be a political opponent, do not dehumanize them. Ever dehumanize them. Doesn't matter how bad the politician is. They are a human being, and the reasons they do things are going to be humans. What they do is going to be human. It's going to be based out of their humanity. And it doesn't, even if they do great evil, yes, you can oppose them for doing great evil, and you can stop them by taking their life if you absolutely have to. But because they're made in the image of God, it is a terrifying thing to have to determine somebody's life. It's much more important than people give it credit for. A much harder decision. Anyway, that's what I wanted to discuss with you all. Just the Imago Dei, the importance of life, and just how we have just lost track in modern society of just their humanity in each person we come across. How we boil them down to a caricature. And it just, we basically take a stereotype and we plug that in instead of the real person. We're not interested in humanity anymore, but deep down inside we do long for it. We want it, which is why we love origin stories and we love people's stories, but it seems like modern society doesn't want to tell it to us. They just want us to look at caricatures. That's not humanity. I'm sorry, but humanity is not a caricature. You can't boil somebody down to, a black person, a white person, a redneck, a Bostonian, LGBT, or woman, or it doesn't matter. It's like you can't take a label and tell somebody's story based off that label or their right to something. None of that can be done. You have to let them have their humanity. You have to. Without it, civil rights itself just completely collapses. Our whole structure in society and equality, everything that we've worked for, everything about all the liberties inside you have, and the privileges to make a life for yourself and to be treated fairly, it all disappears without that, without the Imago Dei.